In the dark days of America's Great Depression, with a war in Europe on the horizon, Americans were anxious for relief and eager to find hope. They found escape in an unlikely hero, a funny-looking horse deep in a losing streak whose rise to fame and fortune mirrored all they could hope for. Seabiscuit was the name they shouted. Tens of thousands packed the stands to see him race. Millions tuned in by radio. His story enthralled the nation.
The story of Seabiscuit really captures the hearts of America. I mean, it's the classic Cinderella story. The horse that really has very little going for him. He came from back east, running in cheap claiming races. Didn't have the best pedigree in the world. Came to the West Coast, got in the right hands, and became a champion racehorse.
Boy, I thought the Seabiscuit walked on water. He was my hero, really.
He was always my favorite horse because he was like a working man's horse, or a blue-collar horse, I would kind of call him, because he came up from the claiming ranks to be one of our greatest horses that America ever saw race.
I think Seabiscuit came around when the country needed him the most. It was the timing, you know, depression. It just was the time that was needed.
Seabiscuit became famous during the worst part of the Depression, when there was huge unemployment and things looked bad. I mean, America needed a hero. The story of Seabiscuit is a true Cinderella story for everyone involved, the jockey, his owner, and trainer. The country fell in love with this horse. I mean, believe it or not, Seabiscuit was the #1 newsmaker of 1938. FDR was second, and Hitler was third.
In the 30s and 40s, you know, thoroughbred horse racing was the #1 sport in America. It was extremely popular. It was very common to have 40, 50,000 people come to the races on a weekend, sometimes even 60, 75,000.
There they go. Hijack is going to the front.
Racing in those days that was the thing. I mean, everybody went to the racetrack. Clark Gable, Victor Mature, Humphrey Bogart, they all came.
This is a time before sports on television. Radio was it. Horse racing on the radio was popular nationwide, and it was a natural. And Seabiscuit was a major star.
Round the rail is second by 3/4 of a length. Zeno Puto is third.
When old-time pirates went out to sea and everything, they couldn't keep regular food, so they gave them these little biscuits to eat. And they would stay for months and months, and they called them, what do you got for ration? They said, we got Seabiscuits. And that's how he got his name.
Seabiscuit is now second.
Seabiscuit was a kind of a short, chunky horse, built a little more like a quarter horse than some of the thoroughbreds, but he did have a real good long hip, with a good shoulder, but his knees, he knuckled over. He was kind of calf-kneed.
He was strongly built, but he wasn't a beautiful horse. He was blocky, you know. He had good shoulders and a good rear end on him.
Seabiscuit was really one of the greatest horses I've ever looked at, conformation-wise. He was bucked over the knee in front, and people thought that was bad. That's one of the best things that can ever happen to a horse, to get him a little bucked over the knee, because of the pressure on the knee. When it's bucked over, isn't near as bad if it goes back in the joint. And he had that. And I think that's part of why he lasted so good.
He must have been a pretty sound horse, because, you know, he ran 35 times as a 2-year-old. That's unheard of nowadays.
Seabiscuit, they run him 35 times when he's a 2-year-old. Now, if that horse had been trying to run, he wouldn't have made it. But he wasn't trying to run. He wasn't doing his best. That horse was fooling around.
This horse, Seabiscuit, he was in New York. The trainer that had him at that time was considered the dean of trainers, but he couldn't get that horse to do anything. He wouldn't work good, he wouldn't do anything, and I forget 25 or 30 races, and he couldn't beat anybody.
Sonny Jim Fitzsimmons, Seabiscuit's first trainer, just didn't understand how to deal with this horse that was so difficult. I mean, it wasn't until his 17th race that Seabiscuit finally won. He had run in 6 claiming races and he was never claimed. Occasionally, Seabiscuit, under Fitzsimmons as his trainer, would burn up the track. I mean, this horse was really fast. And when he finally won a race, he actually broke the track record. He ran fast when he wanted to, but only when he felt like it, which was not very often. After a while, Fitzsimmons was starting to like Seabiscuit, and I think he even figured him out. But on the day Seabiscuit was put up for sale, Fitzsimmons didn't put up a bid and probably later regretted it.
I wish I had been here when that horse ran. Certainly, I also wish that I had had a chance to hear the radio broadcast. It's my understanding that he really made quite an impression on the country when he became a hero and won all those races.
It's probably more popular than Babe Ruth in the 30s.
Well, it won the big cap here in 1940 after an injury, so it made a tremendous comeback. It was the people's choice during the Depression when they needed like an example of courage and a winner. So they got behind that horse and rallied all through 3 or 4 years of Seabiscuit running.
Well, Seabiscuit in 1940 won here in Santa Anita, because we're right here. He won the handicap, and which made it at that time the horse that made the most money.
The horse Seabiscuit was a bad horse. I made money with him before. He's a bad horse. Bet on him. Seabiscuit.
The story of Seabiscuit really is something that captures, I think, the imagination of all of America. Well, so does the horsemen and the people that were involved with Seabiscuit, from the Howards to Red Pollard to the trainer. I think it was it's something that really captures people's imagination.
In the summer of 1936, the Howards headed east to find racehorses for their stable. They first saw Seabiscuit in a claiming race. Not impressed, Mrs. Howard bet Charles a lemonade the horse would lose. He won and soon found a new home in the Howard barn.
The first time I saw Seabiscuit was at Saratoga, and they bought him and was leading him back to the barn. And I looked out there and seen him leading this horse, and I said, they bought a new saddle pony. See? I couldn't take that back, you know what I mean? They give $7,500 for him, and he went from there. That's a pretty horse right here, isn't it? Pretty horse, good looking, a good boy.
So I went to work for CSR and Tom Smith the fall of '36. Tom Smith and Mr. Howard, they bought Seabiscuit at Saratoga Springs from the Wheatley stable, and Fitzsimmons was the trainer. And that they shipped on out to California.
Then Mr. Howard finally wound up with him. That's how he got him. So this trainer, Tom Smith, I don't know what he did to the horse, but there's no such a thing as magic with the horse, but he fooled with the horse and got him to running, and he just kept getting better and better and better, and it's history what the horse did.
Tom Smith, Seabiscuit's new trainer, was the ultimate horseman. I mean, he was a cowboy out of the Old West. Nobody understood horses better than him. I think he understood horses better than people. He certainly liked horses more. I mean, Smith spent most of his life on the Colorado Mustang ranges, where he worked in the Wild West shows. He was the real horse whisperer. And when he got a new horse, he would go into a stall and he would squat down on the floor and sit there for hours without moving, I mean, without saying a word. And he would walk out and he would understand the horse completely. When Smith first met Seabiscuit, he found a horse that was really confused and not very happy. I mean, Seabiscuit wouldn't eat, he circled his stall 24 hours a day, he was at least 200 pounds underweight, and every time Seabiscuit saw a saddle and bridle, he would become extremely nervous. No wonder he never won a race.
Tom Smith, he made people do things his way. If he wanted a good work in Seabiscuit, he would maybe take 2 other horses out in the morning to pick him up at different parts of the racetrack to go on and make him work fast, because by himself, Seabiscuit wouldn't get the time that he wanted him to have. And he'd put him against the watch and other horses, and that's how he trained him.
Smith realized that Seabiscuit needed to learn to run for the joy of it, not because he was being whacked 46 times as he was running down the stretch. And the day that Seabiscuit learned to love running was the most important day of his career. I mean, from what I have heard, the big change happened on a single workout. It was like the 4th day that Smith put an exercise rider on him, and he sent him out to the track. And everything the rider wanted, Seabiscuit would do the opposite. Seabiscuit fought the rider any way he could, and he loved it. Smith totally knew what was going on, and he gave a really strange order to the rider, which was, let him go, let him do whatever he wants. So the rider just dropped the reins and sat there, and Seabiscuit went nuts. Seabiscuit was frustrated because he got satisfaction by fighting his rider and trainer, and now there was like nobody to fight. So finally he just stopped and he walked back to his barn. And I mean, there was nowhere else to go. So when Seabiscuit got to the barn, there was Smith standing there with a carrot. He rewarded him. And from that day on, Seabiscuit trusted and loved Smith. Seabiscuit discovered how much he loved to run. And boy, did they have a speed demon on their hands. He was the fastest horse around.
Come on. Come on, good girl. Come on. Good girl. Some of the other things that Tom did with him was train him in the dark. He'd hide him in the dark. He didn't want nobody to know, because he didn't want him to think that horse was doing so good that they'd raise him up in his weight when they handicapped him. And he was hiding him all the time. He was every place he went, people would go out there to see Seabiscuit because they'd never see him. He'd go to the dark with him.
They didn't call him Silent Tom for nothing. I mean, he didn't like the press, and he would do whatever he could to mess with them. He was once asked to give a long description of the famous Seabiscuit. Tom said, "He's a horse," and walked away.
The reason they called him Silent Tom, because they couldn't get him to say anything, and especially the press. As I remember, they used to be upset with him, you know, all the time, because they'd ask him a question and he wouldn't even answer. Charles S. Howard did all the talking, I guess.
C.S. Howard, he was an owner that he loved to come about around the barn. He loved his horses. He was a very quiet man also, very, very gentlemanly. He had the automobile agency in San Francisco at that time. If you bought a certain kind of a car, you had to go through him. So he was a real nice fellow. He was very interested in racing, and he and Tom was the kind of trainer-owner that both got along real well. It turned out to be very successful for both of them.
Charles Howard, who was Seabiscuit's owner, was a real interesting guy. He was a cavalryman in the Spanish-American War, and when he first came to San Francisco, California in 1903, he worked repairing bicycles. The automobile showed up at about the same time, and they were always breaking down. I mean, people thought that if Charles could fix bicycles, then maybe he could fix broken down cars. So he fixed them up, and he fell in love with them, and then he opened up a car dealership, and he became one of the richest men in the United States.
Within 3 months of entering Howard's stable, Seabiscuit was winning races around the country.
They run him wherever it was, any time it was. You know, he'd go any place to run that horse. He'd go to New York, and in them days, they'd take them, they didn't have no airplanes like they got now. They put him on the train. And I rode that train one time back and forth with him, and it was 6 days. And he got old riding that train, you know. You couldn't take a bath or nothing. We was riding in the car with that horse. And that horse, he was happy. All the way down and all the way back. He didn't care about nothing. He was just a very unusual horse, personality-wise.
Seabiscuit was a real good doer. He was a heavy eater. And Tom Smith used to have to muzzle him kind of in between meals to keep him from eating too much. If they didn't put the food into him, he'd eat his bedding uneven. So they used to put a muzzle on him in between feeding time, and just certain times of the day they'd let him eat. Otherwise he'd put on too much weight.
Whitey was having a lot of time, that was his groom, was overfeeding him. And the horse got a little heavy. Nobody could talk to that groom too good, you know. He was going to do what he wanted to do with that horse. But they sent Mrs. Howard back to talk to that groom and tell him he was going to have to stop feeding that horse so much that they were going to let him go. And he did slow down feeding the horse.
Seabiscuit was a hog, and he would eat everything in sight. I remember the groom, Whitey, telling me he's the one that would have to put the muzzle on him, and that was a problem. Seabiscuit didn't like that muzzle.
Seabiscuit had 2 main riders. Red Pollard rode him most often, but George Woolf rode him for his most famous races.
George Woolf was one of the greatest riders I ever saw, and in this day and age, he'd still be great. He would wait on horses that were dead last at the 8th pole and let them run 8th mile and they'd win. He did things that was unbelievable on a horse. He was great horseman.
George Woolf, he was a little different than all the other riders. Nothing bothered him. He had a wonderful disposition. He could be off not doing anything and come back to the track, and you'd think he'd been riding every day.
He was riding in an era when you just did whatever an owner would tell you, and he was a little independent. He would just ride the horses that he wanted to ride, and he would sometimes just take off and disappear for a couple of weeks just when he had it.
The reason they called George Woolf the Iceman is he was like Eddie Delahousse. You know, he could sit back there longer and wait longer than anybody else, you know, and that's where he was a cool customer. He really was.
I've seen a lot of great jockeys, Pinkai, Delahousse, Nakatani, but wow, watching those movies of George Woolf is amazing. I mean, he becomes one with the horse. Because of his diabetes, Woolf rode like 1/3 the number of horses the other jockeys did, and still he would lead them in money won every single year. He was a phenomenal athlete.
We hear he liked his Hennessy. He loved his cars. He had a great collection of state-of-the-art cars of that time. You know, he had a Accord, and there's pictures of him at Indianapolis and everything else. He just enjoyed life. He was just quite a character.
I remember him very well because he had a car that I loved. He had a powder blue Accord, and it had these big pipes out on the side and everything, and he wore cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, and his cowboy boots had silver toes and silver heels on them, and he was really a classy guy.
He was a dapper. He was well dressed, and all the pictures you see in the scrapbooks and everything else, I mean, he was dressed to the T. You know, he had the hats and the suits, and he was a ladies' man.
And then later, as he got older, he did buy the Derby in Arcadia, the Derby restaurant, and it pictured horses running out of a Derby hat on the front of it for years.
The restaurant originally was Proctor's Chicken House, and it was on Foothill Boulevard, and it was in probably the early 20s. Then in 28, when they widened Foothill Boulevard to Route 66, they brought the restaurant down here. In 28, it was Proctor's Chicken House, complete dinner, 75 cents. Then in 38, George Woolf bought the restaurant for his retirement, and he always said that he jinxed himself by naming the restaurant the Derby because he never won the big race, the Kentucky Derby. There's an apartment above the restaurant, and George Woolf lived up there. Throughout the years, odd things have happened. We used to have a bell that we would ring to give last call for our daily double. And just during the evening, that bell would ring when there was no one around it. And we would have, throughout the years, bringing in crews at night to do remodeling and stuff. And we had about 4 crews quit on us because they heard things. And a few times I had stayed upstairs. You could hear like footsteps going up the staircase and everything else. But he's very friendly, it seems, you know. I mean, the closing managers always say goodnight to him when they leave. But,
Georgie Woolf was there an awful lot, and they had a man that played the piano, and he'd have sing-arounds around the piano, and Georgie Woolf would come in there just dressed like he would be in the morning sometimes, even with, he loved to wear leather jackets that had the frills on the sides of them and a big old Texas hat, and he was a man's man. People really liked him because he could blend in and talk to anybody, and I think he made jockeys more so than they had been before in the public eye.
Nobody ever really talks about how difficult it was to be a jockey in the 1930s. It was a very dangerous sport. 19 jockeys were killed between 1935 and 1939. I mean, they didn't have safety vests then. They didn't have the kind of modern-day helmets that help prevent serious injuries today. I mean, it's dangerous enough today, but you had to be fearless to be a jockey back then. Jockeys were always getting injured. There was no insurance. They couldn't go to hospitals when they were hurt. I mean, they could fall off a horse in the middle of the race and nobody even would go to pick them up. And what they had to do to lose weight, oh my God, it was really awful. The jocks back then had to be even smaller than the jocks today.
We used to put road suits on, and jog with road suits on. And after you'd run maybe a mile with the road suit on, you'd sit down and you'd open up your red suit and let the water drip out and do it up again and go on. I never did myself, but I've seen some of them that went to the extent where they'd be buried under a manure pile for so long with the road suit on to take off the weight.
I used to room with a jock when I first came on the racetrack. He would kill himself just to make 115 or 16. He'd run about 10 miles in the morning and sweat it off and just to ride one horse.
I have heard of some really unbelievable stories. Jockeys would swallow tapeworm tablets. They would sit for hours in steam boxes and run around the track wrapped in blankets. They would binge and then purge. They would take diuretics, whatever it took.
I think that the jocks then were tougher than they are now. I think the game was altogether different than it is now.
Trainers trained a little different in those days than they do now. They're trained pretty hard and run pretty hard out here now. Much different than the old days.
Well, I think in the old days they probably trained less and ran more. They, ran their horses probably continuously. Instead of now, we breeze them and we point our horses for bigger. There's more money to run at, so they run hard every time. So I think that they're probably a different type of horse than they were in those days. I think there was probably a handful of good ones. The rest were just mediocre horses. So nowadays, I think the competition's tougher. I don't know if they're better, but they run much faster than the old days. It's hard to tell, but Tiro running 35 times, that means you probably wouldn't work them in between races. So maybe that's the reason for it. But it'd be tough to do it now, to keep them sound. See, we work our horse between. I mean, if I could race my horse and not work him, I could run him 35 times. So, we probably, between the breezing and the working in between, was probably, 35, 40 times. So that's probably, in those days, they ran them, didn't work them, and that's the way the races came up then.
Jockey Red Pollard was Woolf's polar opposite. Where Woolf was the cocky ladies' man able to choose from the best horses in the country, Pollard was the typical journeyman rider struggling to survive. He wore a St. Christopher's medal for good luck, and given his injuries, he needed it.
Red Pollard was, at the time, galloped a lot of horses. He galloped horses for Tom Smith, who was the trainer of Seabiscuit, and he was at that barn every morning, galloped horses, and that's how he got them out. I'm sure that's how he got on the horse, was through galloping the horses for them. In those days, jockeys rode for stables more than they do now. Now we call them freelance riders. Most all riders freelance.
Red Pollard, they called him the Cougar. He'd always be telling Cougar stories to all the younger riders that'd come in the room. He'd be telling them the Cougar stories that he ran around with the Cougars up in Canada before he came down to the United States.
Red Pollard, at the beginning of his long career, was blinded in one eye from a horse accident, and he had to keep that accident a secret. He had a horse somersault on him at 40 miles an hour, crushing his chest. He was actually declared dead by the newspapers. He had another horse run him into a corner of a barn at about 25 miles an hour and just about sheared his leg off. He was told he would never walk again, but Red just kept coming back. I mean, Red was amazing.
I was on a contract to C.S. Howard, and Red Pollard was at that time riding Seabiscuit. And he came to the barn a lot, and he adopted me. He took good care of me. He was really a father to me for 4 or 5 years. Look at her. She's waiting for that baby. It's amazing. She's a good mare, isn't she? I was playing checkers with John Longdon, and I had him beat about 4 games in a row. We was playing for $5 a game. And so he got up, I said, give him the money. And he didn't give it to me, and I called him a name, and he pushed me down and got his thumbs in my eyes. I'm a little kid, and he's a man. So when Red Pollard got back in the jock's room, he said, what happened to that kid? They told me, run over there and grab that George. He grabbed John Longdon around the neck and twisted his nose. I thought he was going to twist it clear off. And that guy was screaming, and he turned him loose and, don't you ever touch that kid again.
Red Pollard, he was entirely different, had an entirely different disposition than George. And as far as I ever knew, they were pretty good friends.
I think Georgie Woolf compared to Pollard would be a Cadillac, and Woolf would be a Cadillac, and Pollard would be possibly a Model T Ford. That's 10 to 1, I'd say the difference. Every year a good horse came out, Georgie Woolf would be on that horse, and I don't think Red Pollard outside of Seabiscuit, I don't think he ever rode a real good horse.
By August of 1938, it was clear Charles Howard had the best horse in the West. Seabiscuit's closest Western rival was Ligaroti, owned by Howard's son Lynn and actor Bing Crosby. They were eager to take Howard and Seabiscuit down a notch or two and proposed the horses meet at Del Mar, a brand new racecourse near San Diego.
August 12, 1938 was the day Del Mar truly came of age. America's sporting press headed west to watch Charles S. Howard's popular Seabiscuit take on the Argentine horse Ligaroti, owned by Crosby and Howard's son Lynn. Not even comedian Joe E. Brown could thaw the frozen smile of the elder Howard that day, who was looking at a winner-take-all purse of $25,000 and another $15 grand bet on the side. Seabiscuit, the reigning handicap champ, broke from the inside and went right for the lead under Iceman George Woolf. But soon, Spec Richardson had Ligaroti in Seabiscuit's shadow. They raced flat out down the Del Mar backstretch, where Ligarotti poked his head in front for a few tantalizing strides. But Seabiscuit wouldn't quit, even though he was carrying 15 pounds more than his younger rival. They dueled through the stretch. And while the crowd watched the horses, the stewards were witnessing an outright brawl between the two riders. The inquiry took forever, but the result stood. Seabiscuit had won.
After Seabiscuit defeated Ligarotti, he hopped back into his Pullman car and headed east. He had defeated the best horses racing could offer, save one. It was time to meet Triple Crown winner War Admiral.
With Seabiscuit, when he won the Brooklyn, and War Admiral had just shipped in and won the third leg of the Triple Crown, the Belmont Stakes. And at that time, they started to figure which was the best, would wind up being the best horse, Seabiscuit or War Admiral. See, well, War Admiral was the son of Man of War. Seabiscuit was a grandson of Man of War. So they started talking at that time of what if those two horses ever got together, which one would be the best.
I love the picture right behind us of the great match race of 1938. The country was in a depression, and this race brought the country together.
War Admiral could not have been more different from Seabiscuit. I mean, Seabiscuit came from California, which was considered minor leagues, lower class, and Seabiscuit was like the average Joe or the working man's horse. War Admiral, on the other hand, was blue blood, aristocratic, upper class from the East Coast, which was the center of the racing world. And War Admiral was the son of Man of War and was owned by Eastern multimillionaire Samuel Riddle. So it was East versus West, high class versus lower class. What a great matchup this was. I mean, they were both such remarkable animals. It was going to be the race of the century.
In the fall of 1937, tracks all over the country began competing for a chance to host a match between Seabiscuit and War Admiral. Every attempt to schedule a match failed. Finally, Alfred Vanderbilt of Pimlico Racecourse in Baltimore broke the stalemate. The race of the century would be run November 1st of 1938.
The day of the match race, we had been arguing. Of course, I was a Seabiscuit fan, and most of the fellas had been around the racetrack much longer than I had, and they thought the War Admiral had more class than Seabiscuit.
November 1st dawned clear, and the track was labeled fast. The race was scheduled for 4:30 p.m., but by 10 a.m., thousands pressed against the gates of Pimlico, and Vanderbilt ordered that the track open early. For the match race, George Woolf stepped in to replace an injured Pollard. War Admiral was ridden by his regular rider, Charles Kurtzinger.
The match race with Seabiscuit was one of the races of the century, I think. I guess Tom Smith trained Seabiscuit to go right to the front, which they weren't expecting at all. They just thought War Admiral would take the track away from him, but it didn't turn out that way because when the man said go, Seabiscuit was right in front.
They called it the lap and tap in those days, and it was a walk-up start, you know, and it was, are you ready? Okay, let's go.
And they're off, neck and neck for the mile and 3/16 race. Seabiscuit bears down at the quarter-mile pole and pulls ahead by a length. The purse is $15,000, and Seabiscuit...
Tom Smith, he rigged up an alarm clock on a board, and when Seabiscuit would hear that alarm clock, he'd take off. And that's how they did a lap tap start, what they call a lap tap start, and he took the track away from War Admiral.
When they went up for the match race, the two of them, they thought War Admiral was going to be in front. Little Seabiscuit opened up on him going into the first turn, and Woolf settled down on him and just kept him about a length in front. And then War Admiral made a move and got up head and head with him heading for home.
The backstretch battle is hard on both the horses, and it's here that the Admiral makes his bid. But Seabiscuit hangs right on.
Kurtzinger thought He was on the War Admiral. He thought that he was going to sneak up on him down the backside, and he moved up to him.
As they reach the 3/4 mile post, Seabiscuit hangs on to his lead by a nose. Both horses are a fraction under the track record as they reach the mile pole and enter the stretch. It's the Admiral's last bid, and he's failed. Seabiscuit is going away, increasing his lead with every stride. With 40,000 frenzied people cheering him on, the great son of hardtack pounds down to the finish line in the upset of the year.
Spectators were overcome with excitement. They broke through barriers and the inside rail to reach for Seabiscuit as he cruised by. "So long, Charlie," shouted Woolf, coining a phrase that became common on the track. He finished with a 4-length lead and a track record of 1:56 3/5 for the mile and 3/16.
When he won that race, I was stepping taller than I ever did in my life.
Seabiscuit could have retired after defeating War Admiral, but Charles Howard had one more goal: victory on his home turf in racing's richest stakes, the $100,000 Santa Anita Handicap. Victory would ensure Seabiscuit's place as the world's richest horse.
The Santa Anita Handicap in that era was the first 100-grander, they called it. First $100,000 stakes race. Carried a purse of $100,000, 6 figures, which at that time was astronomical.
In 1937, Seabiscuit made his first run at the Santa Anita Handicap. Although the race ended in a photo finish, Howard was confident in victory. He ordered a round of champagne for the press and then discovered Rosemont had won. A year later, Seabiscuit was back for another try. Carrying 30 pounds more than Stagehand, his closest rival, Seabiscuit set a blistering pace. Once again, it was a photo finish, and Stagehand was declared the winner. In February of 1939, while prepping for another attempt at the world's richest race, Seabiscuit injured his left front ankle and came up lame. There would be no handicap victory. He might never race again.
We're at Ridgewood Ranch, home of Seabiscuit. The history of the ranch goes back to 1850. It's been a working ranch since then. This is the home of Seabiscuit, and Charles Howard bought the property in 1921. Seabiscuit came here in 1939 recuperating from an injury. He stayed here for not quite a year before he went back on the track.
When they sent Seabiscuit up to Willits up there, they bred him to 7 mares. Anyway, they had 7 colts by him. They called them the 7 Little Biscuits. There was quite a bit of publicity in those days about them and showed them all lined up together, you know.
At the same time, Red Pollard was recuperating from a bad injury, a broken leg. We moved him up from Los Angeles to Howard Hospital. And so they both recuperated at the same time. They thought that Seabiscuit would never race again, and they thought that Red Pollard would never ride again. And so they both proved that to be wrong.
After 9 months at the ranch, Howard and Smith shocked the racing world by announcing that Seabiscuit would return to racing. Seabiscuit was 7, far too old to defeat younger horses in the big cap.
Santa Anita Handicap of 1940, Charles S. Howard had the entry of Kayak and Seabiscuit. Joe Hernandez announced over the loudspeaker before the race that they had declared to win with Seabiscuit. 2 weeks prior to that, Seabiscuit beat Kayak in track record time in the San Antonio Handicap.
I was at the Santa Anita Handicap when Seabiscuit beat Kayak the Second. C.S. Howard declared to win with Seabiscuit. In other words, Kayak the Second would not be in the race as far as the public was concerned. He announced that over the public address system. Johnny Adams had just won on Kayak the Second, the Santa Anita Handicap the year before, and they were afraid, I think, that Kayak might beat Seabiscuit if they didn't make some kind of a commitment with the other horse.
Here's a horse that's been laid up a year. You don't know what kind of a horse he's going to be, and they still put 130 pounds on him. That's one of the great things about Seabiscuit, really. You know, he carried that 130 pounds like you and I carry an envelope or something.
Seabiscuit was 130 pounds and ridden by Johnny Pollard. His couple was Kayak the Second, ridden by Leon Buddy Haas. Waiting on heel fly, all straight for heel fly. He's going into position. There they go. It's Specify going to the front, winning call on the rail is second. Whitby is third. Seabiscuit on the outside is fourth. Don Mike is fifth. And Royal Spectator.
Seabiscuit could go to the front, or you could take him back. You could do anything with him.
Seabiscuit on the outside is second by an inch. Specify on the rail is third by a neck. Royal Spectator on the outside is fourth by a half a length. Winning call is fifth.
A lot of horses had come to Seabiscuit in different races. Getting to him and getting by him were two different things. Believe me, and that's the truth.
Around the 5 turn, it's Whitby going to a drive by 3/4 of a length. Seabiscuit is second by a head. Winning call is third, and Can't Wait and Kayak on the outside. It's Kayak and Can't Wait. They're turning for home now with the winning call in front on the outside by a head. Kayak is second by a head. Seabiscuit is third by 1 length. And by count into the stretch, it's Seabiscuit in front by a head. Kayak on the outside is second. It's Kayak and Seabiscuit head in hand. It's Kayak and Seabiscuit head in hand. It's Seabiscuit on the rail. Seabiscuit and Kayak. Seabiscuit and Kayak. They're coming down there, and Seabiscuit. Seabiscuit wins it. A new world champion comes down there. He wins it, and listen to the crowd. Over himself. Seabiscuit by 2. Kayak is second by 1. And listen to the crowd roar. 78,000 fans gone absolutely crazy, including your announcer, and he broke the track record. It's up there. Mind you, 11 months away from the races, and here he is, returning a victor, a champion, really, a miracle horse, made by a miracle man of racing, trainer Tom Smith.
Now, people say that Kayak could have beat Seabiscuit, but I watched the race myself, and I don't think he was going to beat him. I think Red Pollard had a little bit left when they got to the 16th hole. That's my opinion, but other people think that Kayak could have beat him. But I was there, and I don't think so.
It was a blessing when he come back the last time and win that race, because that's all old man Howard was thinking about all his life. He thought about that horse. He was the greatest man I ever seen on a horse. Good horse, and took care of him. Not only when they were running, when they went to the farm. He had a castle up there with that horse. It was an amazing situation.
Well, in 1940, when Seabiscuit won his last race, Santa Anita, Seabiscuit went back to Woolf, California, at Ridgewood Ranch. Ridgewood Ranch is about 8 miles from the town of Willits, but Willits is about 130 miles north of San Francisco. The people in this area were absolutely crazy about Seabiscuit, and it was probably one of the most famous things that ever happened to the town of Willits. What we call the Howard House was built in 1905 by William Van Arsdale. It wasn't until 1921 that Charles Howard moved into the house. Charles Howard had a lot of famous guests. Bing Crosby used to come up every summer. Also, Clark Gable used to come up and spend some time here at the ranch. There was a south mare barn and a north mare barn. Each mare barn had 22 stalls in them. The north mare barn was used primarily for weaning the colts, and where they foaled out or gave birth was in the south mare barn. On all these barns there was weather vanes, and the weather vanes were made by Tex Wheeler. Tex Wheeler was also the artist who sculpted the sculpture that stands at Santa Anita today.
Within sight of Tex Wheeler's famous statue of Seabiscuit, there is another monument to racing. George Woolf's statue gazes across to Seabiscuit, the horse he called the greatest I ever rode.
The great horse Farlap, the Australian horse that won every race in Australia, they brought him to Caliente, and he was mysteriously poisoned. And the rider of that horse gave George Woolf a saddle that was made out of kangaroo. And that's what became George Woolf's lucky saddle. That was used his whole career except the one day that he forgot it in his car and didn't have time, and that was when he was killed at Santa Anita.
One January day in 1946, George Woolf rode his final race. There was nothing special about the day, the race, or the horse. He rode Please Me as a favor to a friend.
I asked him how things were going. He says, well, I got a problem. I said, well, what's your problem? He said, well, I have diabetes. And he says, I have to take insulin for it, and I have to make sure I take the right amount. And George Woolf's not going to fall off a horse. I think that he may not have gotten the right amount of insulin in his system, and when he rode Please Me, I think he just blacked out and possibly and fell off.
In his scrapbooks, there's thousands of telegrams of that day, of condolences and everything else.
I remember when I read it, I couldn't believe it, you know. Because George Woolf, you know, he was an icon, really.
That was a terrible thing. And I'm telling you one thing, I've been seeing a lot of good riders. I think Shoemaker was great, Arcaro was great. They weren't greater than George Woolf.
He lived life to the fullest, and he died doing what he loved.
Seabiscuit spent the last years of his life at Ridgewood Ranch. He sired a few runners, helped herd cattle, and roamed the ranch with Charles Howard on board.
Well, this stud barn was built in 1940. It was built for Seabiscuit. He was staying down here at the Mirror Barn for some time, and they felt they needed to take and have a barn just for Seabiscuit.
As a stallion, Seabiscuit wasn't that successful. He did get a few horses that won stake races, but he wasn't any Northern Dancer or anything like that.
Seabiscuit stayed there approximately 6 years, and in 1947 he died. He died right outside of the stud barn. Normally, horses live to be 20, 30 years old. Seabiscuit died when he was 14 years old, so he was relatively a young horse. There was a shop, Charles Howard. Charles Howard lived for another 3 years, and then he passed away. Where Seabiscuit is buried is really unknown, but we know that it's a beautiful spot somewhere here on the ranch.
With the exact location a secret, Howard family lore says that an oak tree was planted over Seabiscuit's grave. Standing tall and proudly, the oak remains as a living testament to a horse whose meteoric rise inspired a nation. Who could forget Seabiscuit, a homely horse who became a hero for all times?